Washington needs to build a fence around the state in 2027.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back in to another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And this episode is brought to you by Mazda. Like our players, we sweat every detail, because when you make every move count, pulling off the unexpected is only the beginning. Stay tuned later for highlights in this week's Moving the Game Forward, Mazda, Move and Be Moved. So we got a really fun show coming at all you ever dare stay. But just a quick reminder before we get going, just wherever you get this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever that might be, please make sure you click that subscribe button, click that little bell down below as well, so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does help the program out a lot. Now, like I said, really fun show coming at all you out there today. We are going to be talking a whole mess of recruiting today. Got a really wonderful question from one of our insiders, so I'm going to talk about some flips in the 2026 class that may or may not come to fruition. Not going to throw a whole lot of names out there. Stay tuned for that. I want to talk about some of the most important out-of-state targets in the 27 class, throw a couple other names at you, because we do love to talk recruiting on the show, but that all starts in the state of Washington this year, because this is one of the most talented in-state classes I've seen in a long time. Depending on which recruiting service you might want to look at, there are as many as 6 or 7 4-star prospects in the state of Washington this year. And I know that's not everything, but that certainly counts for something in terms of long-term projectability, depending on which service you want to go look at and which rankings might match up with you. But no matter which one you look at, there is a bona fide number one prospect, and that's 4-star defensive tackle Tevita Nonu from O'Day High School in Seattle. Now, this is a guy that is, in my opinion at least, the number one overall target on Washington's board, just like 4-star edge rusher Derek Coleman Brusa was in the 2026 class. Now, Washington did a phenomenal job getting a commitment from him pretty early on in the cycle. Now, I don't think it's going to be easy with Tevita, but this is a guy who all you everydayers out there need to keep a very, very close eye on. Penn State just got in the mix for him, and he's set to visit a couple of Husky games, and I say that because he's going to be at the Apple Cup next weekend in Pullman, and then he'll be on campus in Seattle the week after for Washington's matchup with Ohio State. So I think that's really crucial to note, because when you look at some of these talented in-state prospects, a lot of them that do wind up going over to Wazoo to visit for one reason or another, it does usually signal that they are very interested in staying close to home. Now, some big time programs in terms of, just you look across the country, Penn State, Notre Dame have gotten in the mix for him recently, but this is something where, again, I feel good about where Washington stands right now. And especially when you just look at how they were able to prioritize Derek and get that commitment wrapped up rather quickly in early May. That was a really nice win, and I feel like they're going to do something similar with Tevita. And let me tell you why. In-state defensive linemen are so rare in the state of Washington, which is why the 2026 class was an aberration, to be completely honest, where you go and you look at the top 10 players in the class. Yes, there were 3 high-end defensive linemen in terms of ratings, where obviously Derek Coleman Bruce at number 1, David Schwartzel at number 2, Fasiale at number 3. That does not happen in the state. And that's why I know a lot of everydayers were very keen, and I was too, right here on this program, saying that Washington needs to make sure they build a fence around the state and add as many of these high caliber defensive linemen as possible. But a guy like Tevita, especially someone who can play on the interior, which again is why Derek was such an important, such an important target, is one of the things that makes Tevita so rare. Now, if you go back and you look at all of the in-state rankings, at least according to 247 Sports, there has not been another player outside of this 26 class that was in the top 10, at the very least, in the state in terms of playing defensive line since the 2021 class, when obviously JT Tuimoloau, the 5-star edge rusher who wound up at Ohio State, was coming out of Eastside Catholic. That was the last time. So prioritizing a guy like Tevita, and it's something that we've talked about a lot on this year program, where you look up and down the West Coast, it's going to be a really nice year in terms of defensive tackle talent. Elija Harmon is a name I like to throw out there from down in Southern California, but you just look up and down this class, and there are so many talented defensive tackles tackles. And I think that Tevita certainly belongs in that discussion for the number one defensive tackle in the West, just like I've heard from several sources that T.I. Mukais, the Washington commit from Cherry Creek High School in Colorado, is the number one defensive tackle in the West in the 2026 class. So if you can wrap that up, all of a sudden, that elite defensive line that you need to build in order to compete in the Big Ten, you're getting a very big step closer by adding another big-bodied physical presence on the interior of your defensive line. Now, depending on where you look, there are a couple different options for who the number two player in the state might be. But one guy who I wanted to give some love to, who I've seen on campus several times and does seem to be very interested in staying home, is four-star tight end Zach Albright from Glacier Peak High School up in Snohomish. This is a guy who, again, I'm very intrigued in. He only has 8 offers, but you look at that offer list and you'd be surprised where Cal's on there, Michigan's on there, Texas A&M, Wisconsin. That's a really solid offer list for a guy who doesn't necessarily get a lot of national exposure. And when you dive into it, at 6'5", 205 pounds, I'm sure there might be some questions about him sticking at the position long term, but I do trust Jordan Papow and his evaluation when it comes to looking at tight ends. He's got such a nice track record of developing guys who maybe are a little bit undersized or maybe, have one questionable element to their game in one reason or another when you go back and you look at his track record, even beyond Washington. But Zach is a guy that I am enamored with. You go and you watch the film, he does line up and play a lot of wide receiver because, when you look at a lot of big-bodied high school tight ends, why would you do anything else than take advantage of probably your biggest mismatch on the field? Like I said, at 6'5", 205 pounds, he is tremendous at playing outside the numbers and just making contested catches against the competition. But when you are watching a player like this, you don't watch the competition, you watch the kid, and you see a really fluid mover in open space. You see somebody who, again, can be a really nice red zone threat. And as he continues to add weight and learns technique and how to play in line, I feel like he can be a lot like what Decker DeGraff was to Washington's offense in 2024 and what he's going to continue to be moving forward. So this is a guy that I would certainly keep a very close eye on because as this coaching staff has prioritized the state, you've got 9 commitments between the 25 and 26 class, 10 if you want to count 5-star offensive tackle Cody Green, who obviously plays at Mater Dei down in Southern California, but is an Eastside product where he played 2 years at Eastside Catholic before transferring down there. So there's a lot to just really keep an eye on with how much this coaching staff has prioritized elite talent staying close to home. So that's really interesting. And I want to throw a name out there that I don't think some of the everydayers have really given a lot of thought to, but is someone who absolutely deserves to be in the conversation for one of the most important players in the state. And that's 4-star cornerback Maurice Williams from Grant Kapowson. This is a guy who I'm very interested in, where you look at the last couple of classes, Washington has done a really good job prioritizing defensive backs close to home. Elijah Durr, Darian Clemens. There have been some really talented guys locally. And then, of course, you can go back to the 2024 class with Rashawn Clark, who from Washington originally decides to commit to Jedd Fisch down in Arizona and follows him back up through the transfer portal. So this staff has had a really nice nose for defensive backs from this area to come play at Washington or, Arizona, wherever. But Maurice Williams is somebody I'm really intrigued by. At 6'1", 180. His offer list isn't necessarily elite either, but that just gives a whole lot of room for John Richardson and Taylor Mays and Ryan Walters to come in and operate, where the biggest offers that stand out, probably Arizona State, Boise, and BYU. But I think that this is something where Washington's coaching staff doesn't care about the offers some of these other kids might have. They care about the film. And Maurice Williams, speaking of fluid movers, is a really impressive mover in open space. I love his football IQ. I love the way he just gets early breaks on balls. And it's something where when you look at his frame, he's got really, really long arms and is a perfect prototype to play this just press man on the outside that Ryan Walters loves to run. And as he continues to develop and get bigger and stronger, he's someone who I think this coaching staff is going to be keeping a very, very close eye on as this 2027 recruiting cycle begins to take shape and they continue to look for their first commit. Now, a couple other guys I want to throw out as honorable mentions that we've had some nice discussions about on this show in the past. Offensive lineman Gecova Doyal from Puyallup and 4-star quarterback Sione Kaho from Lincoln as well are guys that I think Washington will certainly be prioritizing and are also names to watch. But speaking of names to watch, let's move to some of these guys out of state, including a quarterback I think can be elite. And we'll get there right after a message from our good friends over at Mazda. This episode is brought to you by Mazda's Moving the Game Forward. For those who believe it's not just about playing the game, it's about redefining it. There are moments that do more than put points on the board. They move crowds, move culture, and keep moving the game forward. This week's moment that moved the game forward is Denzel Boston's spectacular 78-yard punt return. I know it came late in the first half. I know Washington was already up by 4 scores at that point in time, but that was absolutely electric, and it showed what the preseason All-American could do. And just another element of his game, the long speed that he's got. He is an explosive mover, and I am so excited to watch Denzel in Big Ten play, and that punt return is a big reason why. When you follow what moves you, the unexpected is only the beginning. And just like there's more to every highlight, there's more to a Mazda vehicle. Mazda, move and be moved. There are a whole bunch of really exciting prospects up and down the West Coast that Washington has put themselves in the mix for in this 2027 class, but really quickly, another in-state guy who absolutely deserves a shout-out. 4-star wide receiver Braylon Pope from Sumner High School is another dude who I think can be a Denzel Boston kind of player in terms of his size and his route running. He's a fun player to watch, and I think one player that Washington might want to pair him with in the 27 class, depending on where they want to go at quarterback, is 4-star Caden Jones from Crean Lutheran High School down in Southern California. This kid is electric to watch on film. He is a really fun mover, a really good athlete. And I know I say that a lot, but especially at the quarterback position, this guy is, I feel like, exactly what Jedd Fisch is looking for in terms of a signal caller, where you look at his mobility outside the pocket and he's got really nice arm talent, but he is so fast when he's able to get out of the pocket and move. Now, he was limited to 4 games during his sophomore season due to a knee injury, but this is a kid who has accrued over 40 offers over his first couple of years of high school. And a big reason why is he is a 2-sport star. And one of the things that Washington has done, and I think which is one of the reasons that I want to make sure that I highlight his recruitment a little bit, is Danny Sprinkle has gotten in the mix too. And Washington has extended a very rare dual sport offer to him. Now, Washington has 2 out right now, which is really interesting. One to him, and then one in the 2028 class to 5-star tight end Titan McNeil, who looks like he's going to be the number 1 in-state player in that cycle, which is one of the reasons that, again, this needs to be highlighted, because that just shows how interested Washington is with this guy. And you look at some of his offer list, and it is the best of the best. From around the country, it's all the other elite programs, Auburn, Alabama, Georgia, Michigan, whatever you want to say, they have probably extended an offer to Caden Jones. Now, when you look at his list, as he begins to cut it down, Washington is among the group that he seems to be very, very interested in. Where you go, you look at a rivals report from Adam Gorney from last month. He named them among the 6 teams that are really standing out to him. So I think that it's certainly worth just keeping an eye on his recruitment there. And as we just kind of look ahead, obviously, Washington has some really exciting quarterbacks. You look at Treston Keeney McMillan and Dash Byerly in the 2025 class, Derek Zammit, the 4-star from New Jersey in 2026. The more talent you're able to add at every single position, the better. No matter who winds up being the quarterback a few years down the line, Caden Jones is somebody you would certainly want competing for that spot. So a name to keep an eye on there. Now let's move on to the offensive line, because there are a couple guys that I want to talk about from the state of Arizona who I am very intrigued by. The first one is Ben Lowther. This is a guy who, when you just look at the size and the measurables, he is a true tackle prospect. At 6'7", 320 pounds, this is a dude who I think is very much in consideration for one of the top offensive linemen on the West Coast, where I know he's rated as a 3-star right now, but you just look at the size, the mobility, and the frame. This is a guy who can absolutely continue to put on weight, refine his technique, and become a true standout at tackle. Now, this is something where when you look at Washington's offensive line depth right now, great. That'd be a great problem to have, where I know I've talked about it a lot. We're in 2026, no matter who the tackles are. If it's John Mills and Dreza Party, you're probably going to be happy. If Paki Finau is playing tackle and Cody Green's at one of the other spots, you're going to be happy. No matter who the 2 tackles are, this coaching staff has put itself in a great position along the offensive line. And adding a guy like Ben Lowther to that mix is phenomenal, because when you can take these high upside guys, especially at tackle, like look at Dominic Harris. That's a guy who has been offered by every elite program in the country because of his high-end upside, and getting him to come to Washington and be a part of that mix at tackle is such a big win for this program. Again, assuming he signs in December, but you just look at adding guys like that in every single year. That's why Ohio State is what it is. That's why Georgia is what it is, because there is elite talent that you are able to churn out on an every year basis, regardless of what the star ranking is. Because this is a guy, when you really go and you turn on the film, he is someone who can absolutely be a game changer for you along the offensive line. And maybe he's one of those guys that does start out on the interior, a lot like might be the plan for Dominic Harris, a lot like has been the plan for John Mills. There are so many ways to get these guys on the field early if they're ready. And I think that Ben Lowther is a guy who perfectly falls into that mold of big, promising body. You add some weight, more weight to his frame, and you just kind of see where it goes from there. But he's someone that I think Washington is well within the mix for. I know he recently made the trip up for a game day visit at Washington too, which is always really nice. And especially with the way these first couple of games have gone, really good time to get him up here. But I look at Ben Lowther, and he's not the only guy in Arizona that I'm very interested in. There are several offensive line prospects that I think Washington has gotten themselves in the mix for, but I want to talk about Dajohn Yarborough, who is from Minnesota originally, but recently transferred to Basha High School, where he's going to block for one of the honorable mentions that I've got on this list in 4-star running back Noah Roberts. But this is a guy who I am just out of this world intrigued by, where you look at the offer list, and again, some of the biggest programs in the nation have gotten in the mix for his services. I know Alabama recently extended an offer, but you look at Dajohn Yarborough, and he is just one of those big, hulking offensive linemen. I think that he is a great comparison for what Dajohn Yang has been for UW in this 26 class, where might not be the highest rated guy in the world, but you think about one of those first off the bus guys who I know it's a little silly to talk about it like that, but that's exactly what this is, where he is just a big physical hulking presence where you can line him up at guard and just run down teams' throats with a guy like that blocking. And I think that that's a lot of fun to think about, because as you listen to Jedd Fisch continue to talk about his plan for the offensive line to get bigger, stronger, more athletic, more physical, Dajohn Yarborough perfectly fits this mold for Washington. And I think that as we continue to watch this 2027 cycle play out, there are a lot of really solid offensive linemen. Another honorable mention is Reese Russell from Colorado. Continuing to stack that unit with as much elite talent as possible is going to be critical, because you look at where that group is right now, there are some promising names where, you look down the line at a Champ Talealia, he can be really solid. Dajohn Yang is one that I mentioned. Paki Finau, if he decides to stay on the interior, or the coaching staff decides to keep him on the interior, that is. I think that there are plenty of really talented guys that you can add to this group. But in 2027, this seems to be a big focus, where I'll talk about the flips in a minute, where I think there's going to be one more addition to this offensive line. I don't know where it's coming from, but there are several options. I think that this is just one of those guys where you can add him, and if he looks like John Mills or Champ Talealia, and you're able to get him on the field early, that's great. And if he's a 2, even 3-year project where you want to make sure he's as strong and athletic enough to get on the field whenever that might be, because right now you want him as a solid backup and then just give him more snaps as he continues to mature, great. There are no bad options with this offensive line, because everyone develops at their own pace, and that's the position that certainly requires the most patience when you think about just different development tracks. And it's something we've seen a lot of here at Washington, where some guys are ready to go right away. Look at John Mills, and there are some guys that take a few years to develop. Roger Rosengarten, I think, is a phenomenal example of that, especially considering that he came in at 260 pounds. So you look across the offensive line, there are so many talented targets, but I don't think there's any position that's more important for Washington in this 2027 class and along the defensive line. And before I get to the guy that I want to talk about, a couple of honorable mentions in that group: 4-star Troy Bowens from Northern California, 4-star Elija Harmon, who I shouted out a little bit earlier as well, from Southern California. I think that those are both guys to certainly keep an eye on. I've just talked about them a little bit. One guy who's I haven't brought up in a while is 4-star Luke Starcevic from North Dakota. He's the number 1 player in the state, according to 247 Sports' rankings. And this is a guy I'm really intrigued by. At 6'5", 250 pounds, he was really productive last year, where he had 26 and a half tackles for loss and 11 sacks in North Dakota. And that's just crazy numbers, and which is exactly what you want to see. But he is a guy who, a lot like Troy Bowens, I'm very curious what Washington's plan for him would be, where you go and you watch the film and he is more than athletic enough to play outside linebacker if you want that to be his future. But he's also somebody who's got the frame if you want him to add 30, 35 pounds and have him just play a true 3-4 defensive end kind of role, or 3-tech, 5-tech. There's so many different things that he can do in this Ryan Walters defense. And I think that this is one of those guys where you just look at what this class can turn into along the defensive line. Obviously, it's going to be very, very important to continue to just invest in that unit moving forward, and probably in the transfer portal for one more year as well. But Luke Starcevic is the kind of guy that can be a really, really impactful player along the interior, thanks to that size, thanks to that athleticism. So if he's someone who, it's not going to be easy to get him, where Washington, before getting Jack Schaefer out of there, I can't remember the last time they got a player from North Dakota to come to UW. So it's not going to be easy, but the fact that he was on campus for an unofficial visit during spring practice was certainly a nice start. And if that continues this fall with a game day visit, that would be a really, really nice win for Washington. One more honorable mention before we move on here is 4-star wide receiver Zarek Sidney from down in Arizona. He's a guy we've talked about on this program a couple times, and I just want to make sure when I'm talking about some of the most important out-of-state targets, he is 100% on that list. But let's flip gears here and let's talk about what could wind up happening in the 2026 class. Right after a message from our good friends over at Drip Drop. If you're trying to stay on top of your routine, whether that's workouts, long days on campus, or staying focused through back-to-back classes, hydration is where it all starts. And that's where Drip Drop comes in. Drip Drop is doctor-developed and scientifically proven for fast hydration. It uses the perfect balance of sodium electrolytes and glucose to help your body absorb fluids quickly, delivering 3 times the electrolytes and half the sugar of a leading sports drink. My go-to flavor has been Fruit Punch. It's a game changer for me. After I'm done playing pickup basketball, I love to do a couple of times a week, and I am just absolutely worn out by the end of that. And Drip Drop always comes in clutch for me. Right now, Drip Dropper is offering Locked On listeners 20% off your first order. Just head to dripdrop.com and use promo code LOCKEDONCollege. That's dripdrop.com, promo code LOCKEDONCollege for 20% off. Stock up now before the heat hits hard. We've also got a message from our good friends over at DoorDash. It's almost the weekend. Time to look back and crown this week's MVP on Who Delivered, powered by DoorDash. Just like you can win every Saturday with DoorDash Streaks, saving more every time you order. These players delivered when it mattered most. Let's break it down. For Washington, Jonah Coleman delivered in a big way. As all he ever dares know. He's leading the country with 7 rushing touchdowns, back-to-back Big Ten Player of the Week after a 5-touchdown performance this past weekend. When the pressure was on, he came through. No hesitation, no delay. And if you've been watching week after week, this performance wasn't a fluke. Jonah is on a streak. And just like Jonah delivered for the Huskies, DoorDash delivers your Saturdays. With DoorDash Streaks, you save every Saturday you order, stack it up all season, and you can save up to $250, including $100 in DoorDash credits. Order this Saturday. Keep the streak alive. Fuel your game day only with DoorDash. Terms apply. Promo period through November 18th. As we wrap up our week here, this segment is brought to you by the Locked On Huskies Insider Program. It's a phenomenal way to stay up to date with everything in the latest and breaking news from everything in UW football, UW basketball, recruiting rumors. Everything that you need to know is right there. And if you have any questions, we respond to every single one. The link to that is down in the description below. You get a free 2-week trial. And after that, it's $4.99 a month. This question comes from Insider Pat, who asks, if UCLA fully implodes, would Washington have a chance to flip David Schwartzel or Anthony Jones? He says it applies for other schools UW lost recruits to, but UCLA seems the most poised for potential disaster. Certainly agree with that. And Washington absolutely has a tremendous need along the defensive line. And this is something that I'm really curious with not just these UCLA guys, but with several other players. And maybe there are a couple out there that have offers. I don't want to throw any names out there because I don't want to start any rumors. And, obviously if nothing happens, I just don't want to say that, oh yeah, this guy's looking at Washington and have that not be 100% true. So I will not be naming any other names in this segment. And I'll tell you why in a little bit as well, where I look at where Washington stands with some of these defensive linemen that committed elsewhere. And I don't think that they are very frustrated that all of them decided to not choose Washington. There are certainly a couple that fall into that department. I think Tristan Givens is number 1 on that list with where UW stood with his recruitment for a very, very long time after his official visit. But I think that with some of these other guys, Washington is not necessarily very frustrated that they left. And if they want to leave whatever school that they've, already maybe potentially signed a revenue share contract with, an IL deal, anything like that, I think UW would be interested in having them commit at the right price. And I don't think that this is Washington trying to lowball anybody or anything like that. But as we just kind of look at what UW's just method has been on the recruiting trail over the last couple of years, there is so much that you can look at and say, oh, okay, I see why they prioritize this guy who might not have been the most expensive player at that position, but he's a really talented guy for reasons X, Y, and Z. And I'm not saying that to run anybody down, but I think that somebody like David Schwartzel, who Washington was very interested in, I think that there's certainly something to be said about positional value versus what he might wind up playing at UCLA versus at Washington, where I think he's a guy who might want to play a little bit more on the edge. And I think Washington valued him a little bit more as a traditional 3-tech kind of guy who might need a redshirt year before he's ready to fully ingrain himself into the defense. And I think UCLA might have offered him to play right away, which was a big reason that he might have made the decision that he did. And I look at a guy like that. I look at somebody like Anthony Jones, who maybe in that same ballpark might wind up playing a little bit more on the outside when Washington wanted him to play on the interior as well. There are several just other reasons that have gone into players' decisions and to go elsewhere. But let's be clear about one thing with all this. Each situation is unique in this, right? And I think that money certainly played factors in some recruitments. I think fit certainly played factors in some recruitments. And these are things where no matter who these players are, which is why I want to keep this very, very broad, no matter who these players are, if things were to open up again, I think that concessions might need to be made on both sides if it were to work out at Washington. And I think that that's something where it's not so much UW is not willing to go above and beyond and spend for the right person. I think that it has a lot to do with this coaching staff, this front office personnel wanting to stick to their guns in terms of development and in terms of evaluation and saying, okay, this is where we value X player. This is where we value Y player. And we believe that this is the most that we will offer in terms of revenue sharing versus what you might want them to make in NIL and so on and so forth. And I think that's something where, especially along the defensive line, that has contributed to a ton in this 2026 class. So I think that's something to keep an eye on that side. And especially as I look at this class, we're not going to see a ton of flips either way, no matter what. And I think it's, especially when you look at where Washington's needs were addressed in 2025 versus 2026, I think that this coaching staff is very, very happy with the roster it's put together. And I think it's also very happy with just where it's going with this current class. And that's not to say that upgrades can't be made. That's not to say that if X or Y player were to say, hey, I'm really interested in flipping from wherever I'm committed to Washington, that this staff would not be very interested in doing that, especially, again, outside linebacker being the number one position that I would keep an eye out for that. I look at offensive line at number 2, but outside of that, I think this coaching staff is very, very set and very happy with what this 2026 class has turned into, with where the roster is going, and where, especially as you look at what this team is going to need to do to compete in 2026, in 2027, there are certain upgrades and roster spots that need to be available for the transfer portal. And I think especially the defensive line is the number one where you're going to want to just keep an eye on for that, because offensive line, I think if you add another player in this class, whoever it might be, you'd be more than happy. But if it doesn't happen, I don't think this coaching staff is going to be overly frustrated with that, because we saw what that looked like in 2025, where I know people were clamoring for 1 or 2 more offensive linemen in the transfer portal last December. And if the line keeps playing the way that it does in Big Ten play, I think that it's going to be something where, oh, okay, no, this coaching staff stuck to its guns on its evaluation and was happy with where everything wound up. And I think we could say that moving forward as well, where you look at this class, and if these are the only 3 defensive linemen that sign in Tom Malu, Derek Coleman-Brusa, and Tiayu Mukais, you can look at that and say, okay, yeah, you go and you add X and Y player through the transfer portal, maybe a defensive tackle or 2 and an edge rusher. There are so many different ways that this class could work out, but I think that I'm going to go ahead and call it 98% complete as of right now. And I think that's something that's very important and worth keeping an eye on, because there is a lot of talent in this class. And I'm sure there are going to be, to quote Chris Peterson, vultures from all over the country that are going to try and swoop in and take one player or another. Again, I'm not going to name any names to not put just false rumors out there. But as I continue to look at this class, I think Washington is overly pleased with what it has turned into. Upgrades are always possible, but this is one of those things where when we look at this roster come, let's just say February, and guys are on campus for winter workouts, going through all that sort of stuff, I think that people are going to be very, very happy with the state of Washington's roster. And a lot of it is going to be because of these building blocks in the 2025 and 2026 classes, like I was talking about on yesterday's show. But that's all I got for you today. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate it. And if you want to make sure that you're up to date with everything in the world of Husky athletics, please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll talk to you on Monday.